Okay, we'll make a start. We have a lot to get through. I'm very conscious of that. So, Borada Acroiso, good morning and welcome. Shudaki Geed, how are you all? Edwina Dwi, Dwin Gwaithio a Canolfan Gwasanaethau Cyhoeddus Digidol. I'm Edwina and I work for the Centre for Digital Public Services, heading up the Communications and Engagement team. So our role at CDPS is to support the public sector in Wales to design and deliver better public services based around the needs of those who use them. And part of that is knowledge sharing, highlighting good practice and learning. And our webinar series is one way in which we do this. We have a great session, indeed a great series lined up for you over the coming weeks in partnership with the Office for National Statistics. More on that in a minute, but first I just want to do some housekeeping. So we've set this up as a Teams webinar, which means by default you should be joining on mute, and I can see that many of you are. If this isn't the case, please do pop yourself on mute to avoid any distraction for our presenters. It's a longer session than normal, as you can imagine. Trying to cover something as complex as the census that's 10 years in the making is really hard to do in shorter sessions. So after the first presentation, we will take a short break of 5 minutes. A short comfort break before coming back to the second half of the webinar, and we do aim to finish on time at 11 a.m. The session will be recorded, so if you do have to duck out or think that the presentation will be of interest to colleagues post-event, the link will be shared with you, and the slide deck will also be shared as well, and there's some really useful links in there for you to peruse at your own leisure after the event. Llynnos will be live tweeting the session. Diolch Llynnos. This thread will also be a really useful quick reference point to look back on, and you'll find us at CDPS_Cymru on Twitter. If you have any questions, please pop them into the questions and answers box. You will see that at the top of your screen. We also have the chat function, but if you have any questions, please do try and put them in the questions box because it means we keep everything in the one place. We have allocated plenty of time for questions at the end, and we do aim to cover as many as possible. But Rob and the team have kindly said that if we don't get all the questions covered, that we will pick them up post-event and make sure that we do come back and provide a response to you. If you'd like to contribute in Gymraeg, we have Allow on hand to translate, so please do pop your questions in English or in Welsh into the questions and answers button. We will also be asking for feedback at the end of this session, and we're going to be using something called Menti for this. If you've not used it before, you will need to open a separate tab or use your phone and go to Menti, which is menti.com. We will be providing a code for you to enter at the end of the session, and that's really to provide us instant feedback as we prepare for session 2 and 3 as part of this series. So what are we going to cover then? Well, as I said, this is a 3-part series in partnership with the Office for National Statistics, looking at the end-to-end journey for delivering a digital-first census. It'll cover the design and build, the collection and processing of data, and then how this data is brought to life. I'm sure you all know, but the census, put simply, is something that happens every 10 years and gives us a picture of all the people and households in England and Wales. This data is used then to help develop policies, plan and run public services, and allocate funding. I won't go into any more detail because I don't want to steal the presenters' thunder. So Croeso Mar, Helena Roshechka and Sarah Jones. But first, to set the scene from the ONS is Rob Doherty. Rob, over to you.
Diolch, Edwina and Borodar, everyone. Firstly, I think before we begin, I'd like to thank the Centre for Digital Public Services for this opportunity, for the hard work that they put into making it happen. And just to say thank you as well to you all for attending today, and hopefully the other sessions that go into this series that we put together on delivering a digital first census. Next, it's okay. I'm not driving the slide, sorry. So I won't linger too much on myself, just to say I'm Rob Doherty. I was and am the collection and addressing lead for census statistical design. So making sure that our operational design that we had underpinning the collection of data in census would then lead to high quality statistical outputs. I'm not, I think as we had said, I'm not one of the presenters today, but I will be presenting in the next session, and I'm just really, I guess, kind of giving a brief introduction and scene setting today. So I think, as I said, we're excited to be able to talk to you today, and in future sessions about the journey that we went on, and I guess to give more context to that, I guess we've done a lot of kind of engagement and outreach and publicising of, say, our headline figures, first from the kind of overall return rate that we had to the census across England and Wales, 97%, and then with each of our kind of statistical releases and estimates. But I guess we talk less publicly about what goes into actually making that happen, and kind of the journey that we went on from that. I think it's worth kind of reiterating, as the slide says, every census is different because we only in the UK conduct a census every 10 years, and in that time society, the socioeconomic context can change quite a bit, and also as well the questions that we ask are different. And I think crucially as well for this census, the technologies used are different, and those then provide us with opportunities, but also as well kind of create additional complexities, and that's in ways that we anticipated, but I guess in some ways also in ways that we didn't anticipate. So this series tells part of the story for Census 2021, and yeah, next slide please, if that's okay. Just to very briefly sort of say, as far as that journey goes from our perspective, we're talking about a digital first census that we carried out this time around, but I think it's worth kind of saying within that the what underpinned that from our perspective was to plan a census to maximize the number of people who can complete the census in the way that they wish to complete it. So it wasn't purely for our own convenience, it was also to provide people more opportunity, a greater kind of user experience. And so that then, even in being kind of digital by default, meant that we had to think about the people who wouldn't necessarily want to take that route as well. So we designed the operation in using kind of the technologies we had as well to make sure that we reminded people most effectively, and that we were able to identify those who would need extra support during live operations. So next slide, please. So apologies, this is a little bit busy, but just again to give a kind of overview of the three sessions that we have and the way that we've kind of planned this out. Edwin has already given quite a succinct introduction to this, so I won't sort of dwell too much on kind of each of the sessions. Just to say that the way that we've tried to frame this is today, Helena and Sarah will be talking primarily about the designing and the building of Census as a digital service, so that being the respondent facing sort of most crucial part being kind of the questionnaire that people themselves fill in, and then all of the digital products that kind of underpin the service that we provided there. And then in the next session, myself and Pete Large will talk more about how the digital technologies that we had and some of the design features we had enabled us to design a collection phase to maximize response, and then to assist with processing that data and QAing it as well. And then finally, and probably the bit that is kind of still in development and is kind of most exciting in some respects, is how the statistics produced from Census are being brought to life in new ways on different platforms, and then also looking to the future, how ONS will engage with stakeholders to determine the future of population and social statistics. So what comes next after we delivered the census, and how you as kind of stakeholders can be involved in that. So then the next slide, please. The final thing that I want to say is, even though we have more time today and this is quite a lengthy session, I don't we can still only give a snapshot of the the census and everything that went into it, even though we're covering a lot of ground. We've aimed to be as transparent as possible in how we've arrived at the results from Census 2021. So these sessions provide a taste of what went into that and the future plans that we have. But there's much more information that's provided on the website around our methodology and our quality assurance processes and aspects of our design features as well. It can be a little bit difficult to navigate the website, I will admit that, but it is quite a comprehensive resource. And within this slide deck, I've just listed a few of the links to papers that we published that kind of underpin some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about today and in the future sessions as well. So next slide, please. Yeah, so just to say, I'll now hand over to Helena Rajecka, who will talk about the design of the questionnaire, and then, as Edwina says, once Helena's delivered that, we'll have sort of a 5-minute break or so. So Helena, I'll hand over to you now. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Rob. And an apology to everyone in advance that I am very allergic to the world today. So if I suddenly stop, it's because I need to sneeze. So here I'm Helena Rajecka. I was head of question and questionnaire design for the 2021 census. That's focusing on the words on the page. So I was not the one responsible for building the EQ itself and all the functionality that goes into that, but I worked really closely with our electronic questionnaire team to make sure that the words on the page and the functionality worked really well together. So what our role was looking at the online and the paper forms for England and for Wales. And obviously in Wales, we had both English language and the Welsh language. And when we were developing the Welsh language form, we were working really closely with the Welsh Government and the Welsh Language Commission to make sure that that Welsh language product was as high quality as the English product. So as everyone said, the aim of Census 2021 was to be digital first and also to optimise by mode. This meant that instead of aiming to get the same quality of data on each mode, we were aiming to get the best quality data each mode allowed. So this was limited to a certain extent by the census questions being mandatory. This means that they're written into law, and so that the questions and response options by mode had to be identical. But what we could change was how the words were presented and the instructions that went with them, and these were designed for each mode to get the best quality of data we could. As the paper form was constrained by the number of printed pages, it meant that overall we expected to receive slightly better quality data online, which was our primary mode. So when I was thinking about digital benefits of the fact that we were digital first, I thought of them in 4 different ways. But one, that the digital form is spacious, like you've got a whole screen worth of space for every question. It's also adaptive in that it means you can take into account that information that the respondent has already provided, such as using piping, so providing information from a previous question into a later question, and also more complex routing, and it can be changed. Not something you would want to do last minute, but it's something that was a possibility that wouldn't be possible on a paper form where millions of forms have had to be printed in advance. The next area is interactive, so helping the respondents provide the accurate answers through validation and search as you type functionality, and also refreshed. That's where the design of the online actually fed back into the paper design. So things that we'd developed as good functionality for those completing online, where it was appropriate, we then fed it back into the paper design where we had space to do so. So the rest of the presentation, I'm just going to go through these one by one with some examples of how that worked out in practice. So starting with the spacious design, so providing that additional information for those that need it. The second address question is a question that, although might seem quite boring to some, it's an amazing example of several of the benefits of being digital first. So starting here, my focus is on the instructions. The instruction here on the paper form is quite short and sweet. Oh, you can't see my mouse, but it's where the purple arrow is at the top, and it says these days could be in a row or separate in English. The Welsh speakers might note that the direct translation of Welsh here is these days could be one after the other or separate. This is because this was considered to be clearer than the direct translation of in a row in Welsh. And we were aiming to make sure that we had a similar concept in Welsh and again, optimize the question for the language as well as the mode. So we weren't constraining ourselves to saying the exact same literal words in English and in Welsh, but giving the same meaning in English and Welsh. So now if we move on from the English version, where it's these days could be in a row or separate, we've got the online version. And you can see here, because we've got a full screen's worth of text, we actually have space to provide further information. So the main instruction is these should be a single address and could be more than 30 days in a row or divided across the year. So that's taking that same in a row or separate, but expanding it out with a few more words to make it really, really clear. It also adds another key fact, which is just one address, so a single address. This is not a draft and clarifies the separate more. On paper, this took an extra line of text that we didn't have available, so wasn't able to be put on, but was able to be put on in online. Then also you can see that there's an additional instruction. So that twisty, when you first came onto the page, so that's the blue line that says what we mean by another address, would be closed when someone first came onto the page. And if they needed that information, so if it's someone that did have a secondary address or thought that they might have a second address but wasn't quite sure, it meant that additional available information was available to them. However, for those who didn't have a second address, it was hidden, and so it wasn't disrupting their flow of answering the question. Ditto, on paper, they would have had this information, but as response options for the next question. So they did have it, but not in as effective a way for the readers to work their way through this. And whereas on paper, the first and the second question are both on screen at the same time, online, the second question is not visible. And so they don't have that information at the time. So it provides that extra information in a different way. You can also see that the writing space for the yes options isn't available. So it says yes, an address within the UK and yes, an address outside the UK. Whereas on the paper form, it was straight into providing address fields, which is a lot more complicated for people to look at. So here it was just on yes there, and then on the next screen, if they've selected one of those, they would get the opportunity to put those in. As another aside for those who speak Welsh, you'll notice that UK in English is just the acronym, and in Welsh we've written it out in full because again our testing found that DU wasn't as well understood as UK, so it was better to write it out in full. I won't attempt to pronounce it because I will destroy it, so apologies for that. So as you can see, there's lots of different small things going on with this question where we've really tweaked it for online. And although none of these things are particularly large, working together, they actually make a massive difference to the respondent journey in answering these questions by giving them that detailed information, but in a way that only those who need that information are receiving it. And again, having the option to put in the addresses, but only presenting that to those that need that information. So again, like I said, this is a multi-stage question. So whereas on the paper, it's only a single stage question. So this is the second stage for the what is the other UK address. And this is also one where we used the search as you type, because as you start writing this, this is an address lookup. Which will make it easier for those whose addresses are on the address list we have available. But if your address did not happen to be available, the digital public AQ team have built in as well that manually enter address button, so that gives people an option if their address doesn't come up in the search as you type. So that is the second address question, and as you can see, I get very excited by the second address question because there's lots and lots of intricacies going on there. So the next area is about the questionnaire being adaptive. So the multi-stage questions also link to this in terms of those second stages or even tertiary stages are not shown unless it's available to the person. So if they don't have a second address, they wouldn't even be presented with those screens. Whereas on paper, the person has to do that. Routing is the word I'm looking for. Routing themselves and follow the instructions. We can also act on information the respondent has provided us with in other ways. So the next one is our question on proxy response. So this is a question that was added in primarily to help the respondents answer the question. So at the beginning of the individual section for each person, it would ask you, are you the person you're filling in for? And you either say, yes, I am, or no, I'm answering on their behalf. And the whole rest of the form is based on that piece of information. Because if you say, yes, I am, it would say for the next question, how old are you? Whereas if you said you're answering on their behalf, it would say, how old is Sophie Wood? And that meant that people were able to really closely connect with the questions that they were answering. And it makes it easier because when it says you know it's yourself. And when it says Sophie Wood or another member of your household, you know exactly who it is. This was also quite helpful in terms of quality assurance, so that we know for some of the more subjective questions if that was being answered on behalf of the person or by themselves. Because of this additional quality factor, we also added this question to the paper form. So although it couldn't obviously lead into the typing on a paper form, it was still helpful for that quality purposes. So the next one is around adaptivity, is about the timeliness. So this is a bit different in terms of it's like if something dramatic happens in the world, so in the case of the census, there was the coronavirus pandemic, the online form gives a little bit more possibility to change. Obviously not something you want to do last minute, but as the coronavirus pandemic showed us, that can happen. So on paper, no changes can be made after the product's been sent to print. Millions of copies were needed, so that this was well in advance of the census date. And in contrast, although there is a digital change freeze defined by the length of final online platform testing cycle, this is far closer to census day than the print date. So this meant that we could look at the instructions and things really close to the census date and take into account the fact of the pandemic, which is a really, really important benefit of the online form. So we did add some additional guidance, really helping people base themselves on census day, because we had some questions that used words such as mainly or usual on some questions where they weren't really sure because of that if we should be looking backwards, looking at the current day, or looking forwards. So, and different respondents responded to that in different ways. So they did all three of those different things, depending on usual or mainly. So we had this really strong need to tell people, we want you to look at things right now. So as a result, some additional guidance was added into the form. And this was generally to reinforce the message that Census 2021 is a snapshot in time, and that the respondent should answer based on the situation as of 21st of March 2021. So we added 2 interstitial pages, which looked like on the screen, just stating that your circumstances may have changed during the pandemic, but answer all the questions based on the situation as it is now. This was also reinforced on specific questions where wording was causing ambiguity, and there was also a small number of questions which had specific guidance added. So, for example, there was a question 1 year ago, what was your usual address? And the general message caused increased burden to respondents because the start of lockdown was very close to the 1-year period prior to census day. Therefore, because there was a minimal expected impact on the results, the guidance was modified slightly to reference the situation immediately before circumstances changed. So this read, if the coronavirus pandemic affected your usual address 1 year ago, select where you were living before your circumstances changed, because the difference between, I think it was something like the 16th-ish versus the 21st, it was really, really close. So in terms of the statistical results, there was very little impact, but in terms of the respondents' perception of what was going on in the form and the complexity of them answering it, it was a major burden. Another example shown here. So prior to the pandemic, there would have been a very small number of people on furlough, in quarantine or self-isolating. So specific instructions for these were not in the form at that point. However, obviously this dramatically changed, and our testing showed that they didn't all identify with the nearest matching response option, which was temporarily away from work ill, on holiday, or temporarily laid off. For example, those who were self-isolating weren't necessarily ill. Because this was a response option, and so written into law, we couldn't change the words of the response option. So we had to help the people in terms of answering this through additional instructions. So there at the top, you can see we've added the instructions. If you have a job but have been off work on furlough, in quarantine, or self-isolating, select temporarily away from work, ill, on holiday, or temporarily laid off. So this is a very specific instruction. This is telling them what to do, because in this situation, they needed that very specific instruction because it was not clear to them what to do. And we also used bold here. In general, using bold is not great for accessibility reasons, but in this particular instance, that use of bold was kept to really help the people find that, so that it was really drawn out and helps them find that additional instruction. Specific COVID messaging was also added to the relevant online help pages. So these were pages that could be reached from the form through pressing the help button down at the bottom of the page. I don't think I've actually kept it. It would have been in the bottom banner. There was a button asking about help. And if they'd have gone to those pages, they'd have got additional specific COVID guidance, which would have helped a smaller group of people, for example, in certain cases, and again, reiterated those overall messages. So my next section is about interactivity, so helping the respondents to provide their accurate answers. The first type of interactivity I want to talk about is one I had absolutely no part in designing and can't claim any credit for at all, which is the toggle functionality built into the question by the digital platform builders. So up at the top there, you can see it says Cymraeg, and when you pressed that, you would switch to Welsh, and if you were in Welsh, it would say English, and if you pressed it, it would switch back to English. In the 2011 census, you had to choose at the very start of the form which language you were going to do, and that would stick with you for the entirety of the household form. So if you lived in a household where there was one person who spoke Welsh and wanted to complete the form in Welsh, and another person who was English and wanted to complete the form, spoke English and wanted to complete the form in English, the household would have to choose between those two languages, meaning that very few people ended up completing the form in Welsh. Whereas this gives you the opportunity to switch languages on a page-by-page basis. So those who are potentially less strong Welsh speakers but wanted to give it a go had that opportunity because they could work through the questions in Welsh, and if there were any particular words they were struggling with, they could switch over to English for that particular question. And it also meant where there was a strong Welsh speaker in the household, but maybe the other household members weren't, that member of the household could complete their form in Welsh as they preferred, but other members of the household would could complete in English. So that's a really, really, really major change between 2011 and 2021. Then looking at the same screenshot, there's also validation going on. So this is the date of birth page. And as you know, the age of the respondent is really, really important. And it is one, because it's being a three-part number input, that's more likely to have a mistake in it. So people quite often typo the year with the current year, or things like that. So here, the validation did a lot of things. So it looked for answers that were complete and numeric, answers that were not in the future, nor more than 115 years prior, because the oldest person in the country at the time was 113. And it also describes the type of error. So for example here, the month is 14, so it's asking you to enter a valid date of birth. And in the Welsh one, it's asking you to enter a date of birth after the 21st of March 1905, because that's too many years ago. No one's that old in the country. It also, then this is another key feature of the online that couldn't be replicated on paper. It calculated your age for you and allowed you to confirm your age. So for example, here we've got you are 9 months old. Is this correct? So in the case of someone who's accidentally put in the current year rather than their actual year of birth, they can see, oh no, I've made myself 9 month old, and correct it really easily. I've also specifically used the example of 9 months old here. So this changed depending on the age. So if you were 9 years old, it would say years, 9 months old, months, weeks and days. So it really worked its way down so that a baby less than a week old could be reported as being 5 days old, for example. As well as validation. I've got a typo on this slide, sorry about that. So as well as validation functionality, the mutually exclusive functionality shows interactivity. So I've put both slides here in English just because it's the validation I'm looking at rather than the words on the page. So if a respondent selects an option, it gives a border to indicate it. So on the left-hand side down at the bottom, you can see none is ticked, and you should be able to see that that border is deeper and darker than the other ones. Now, if they then change their mind and select on the right hand side that they do have passports, so here I've ticked United Kingdom and other, you can see that it's automatically unticked the none and taken that bold outline away. So this is an automatic thing. It is not possible to tick both none and the others and then remain ticked, but the bolding around the boxes makes that really visible to people. So then my last example in the interactivity space is that search as you type functionality. We mentioned this previously in relation to address 1 year ago. As you start typing the address, it gives you the suggestions of the best match. And this was also applied to socio-demographic questions such as the passports held question. A future area of development would be to look at if this could be applied to more complex scenarios. So one of the areas which remained a write-in without search as you type were the occupation and industry questions. So my last area of development where we really made massive differences between 2011 and 2021 in the digital space is refreshed. This is more about how the move online can create the opportunity to look at the other modes again. So in 2011, the household questionnaire online looked like this. It was basically the exact same layout as the 2011 paper questionnaire, but online. So the look and feel is a paper sort of form rather than a digital form. So you've got the questionnaire, the question number, for example, showing question number 25, and the arrow icons to instructions, and then at the top and down the side, the respondents told which questions they've been routed around. So they're seeing the routing that we're doing for them. So for 2021, we revisited this for the online. and created those questions to be more suitable for online. Here, for example, we chunked up the types of qualifications question, which was one giant question on the paper in 2011, to create standalone questions. So we separated out the instructions into an interstitial page. Then we asked standalone questions on degrees and apprenticeships. And then we asked 3 questions on A-levels and equivalents, GCSEs and equivalents, and MVQs and equivalents, ending for those who hadn't selected anything with a question asking about any other qualifications where they didn't know the equivalent, and whether they were gained abroad or in the UK. So as you can see, that's basically taking what was already there, but breaking it down a lot further, stage by stage. Having done that for online, we knew that this was a much better experience for the paper, for respondents. So we looked at whether or not we could replicate that approach within the constraints of the paper form. And this is something we couldn't do in its entirety because there wasn't sufficient space. But as you can see, we partially managed it. So there was a specific question that was the instruction, and then a specific question that was on apprenticeships, and then on qualifications of degree level above. Then the last 3 questions, we didn't have sufficient space to split out in their entirety the way we did online, but we did have space to give them subheadings. So this is something we use on paper for the ethnic group question, and also type of accommodation questions, and also something that people completing a paper form would have seen already in other parts of the form. But it makes it much easier for them to split out and find the response options they need, and is much closer to that online experience. So this is where the online experience can be reflected back into the paper to a certain extent. So where we had learning from online, we reflected that back. So that is all the massive detail I wanted to give you today. And then I just wanted to bring that back to how that all brings together. So lots and lots of tiny little changes there. Given in the example of second address, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 different things in terms of those different benefits being covered. All of those were quite small in terms of quality increase, but brought together, they made a massive difference to that respondent journey. There is still a lot more to learn that can be fed into other social surveys and any future censuses. For example, how to incorporate the more detailed guidance needed by a smaller minority without negatively impacting the experience of the majority. So those online help pages gave a wealth of additional information for those that needed it, but wasn't the most easy for them to get to. And also looking at the search as you type functionality, could it be used to improve the collection of occupation and industry data? So still loads and loads to learn, and I'm really excited about that because I've now moved on to development of social surveys questionnaires, and I'm trying to move the learning I've got from Census into that space. So next couple of slides are just some contact details. So if you've got any questions that aren't covered or you think of after this seminar, please feel free to email Census Customer Services. And also I've got some key links of a lot of the questionnaire development was published. We published individual reports on every single one of the questions we designed, and all of that's available online. Cool. And now I think I'm passing back to Edwina.
Lovely, diolch yn fawr, Helena. Really insightful in terms of the importance of words and language and the content, and also how you worked with the designers on the interactivity of it. So thank you very much. I certainly have lots of questions. You mentioned quite a lot about a better user experience. So I'm sure there'll be some questions coming up in terms of kind of some of the user testing that was done. Lovely. So we're going to take a short comfort break. For those of you who joined us after I gave my introduction, I was saying that this is quite a long session. There is a lot to squeeze in. So we're going to take a short comfort break for 5 minutes, and we'll come back then for the second half of the webinar, which will be kicked off with our second speaker, Sarah Jones, and then plenty of time for questions and answers. So please do pop any questions that you have into the questions and answers tab, which is at the top of your screen. So if we can be back here for 10:17 to be precise. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Croeso Pub. Welcome back, everybody. I can see Sarah's getting ready to present.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, but not the presentation. I'm seeing two of myself.
Yeah, I know. I can't seem to for whatever reason. Can you see that now?
Yes, there we go.
I stopped and started again. Thank you.
No worries at all. Lovely. Thank you so much for coming back, everybody. So the second half of the webinar, we're going to hear from Sarah Jones. Sarah's got a presentation which is going to take about 20 to 25 minutes, and then we've got plenty of time for questions. So Sarah, over to you when you're ready.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm Sarah Jones. I'm Programme Delivery Manager in ONS. I worked on the Census for about 4 years, and I was responsible for 6 of the products for Census, as well as also the end-to-end integration with those products, and also the external suppliers, of which there were quite a lot. I'm going to give a quick overview of some of the things I think are relevant, but then my main task will be to go through how all those products integrated with each other. So the first thing I'd like to speak about is how the digital teams were established and organised, and how the digital products developed from 2019 rehearsal to Census 2021. So we started with a very small team for the 2017 test. There was only one team, and it really was around the electronic questionnaire and our response management system. In the middle of 2018, it was recognised that in actual fact, the census was not just a big survey, which up until that point, I think some people who hadn't done a census before actually thought it was. So we began to build up the teams for the rehearsal in about middle of 2018. The main part of that was our Census Architecture and Technical Design team, also known as CATD, were established to build the underlying infrastructure for all the ONS digital products, and also to support the teams. There were 2 product teams based in Newport and 3 product teams based in Titchfield, covering 8 digital products in total. There was also a large team which were responsible for mainly the devices for field and engagement officers. I think in the end, there was about 30,000 field officers that we had, and they also had to have all devices for when they went out round knocking on doors, and also for things like the census engagement officers, so that they could build up that rapport with their local areas, in for say like the Sikh population as an example, to try and get people to complete the census. From 2019 to 2021, a lot of the work we did was scaling the systems. We did a huge amount of performance testing during that time, and also made changes to enable the systems to scale more easily. We did a successful rehearsal, but there was quite a lot of the features for some of the products which weren't there. So we carried on building those. Web chat, as an example, is something which was added from our contact centre external supplier, and which had to reach into ONS. We also, Helena made reference to the type ahead functionality of EQ. So although it's displayed on EQ, that actually calls into our address index matching service, which I will go into a bit later. But that was something, the type ahead wasn't in there originally, and that was something we built for it to be used. We also built something called the FSDR, which is the Field Staff Data Repository. Now, originally, all this really was just a lookup of all the field officers and their details, and allowing that to be put into our ServiceNow system, which is like our help desk. However, it was realised that from the rehearsal that to actually do a lot of the other things like setting up phones, activating the lone worker solution wasn't feasible to do it manually as it had been done for rehearsal. So we utilised the functionality in our FSDR system to enable that to all be done automatically. And I think it was a miss that it wasn't realised that it was needed before, but it was amazing for 2021. The next area is about user research, content design, interaction design, and the ONS design system. So as Helena has alluded to, there's a massive amount of research, both in terms of the questionnaire, but also going out and doing research from an accessibility point of view. I remember being walked through the user research that had been done for someone who had sight issues. And I could not believe how every single part of that questionnaire was tested for them. And, you know, we made some changes as a result of that. It was just unbelievable the amount of work that goes into it. We built prototype for a lot of the systems, so that in actual fact we didn't spend a lot of time actually building something which wouldn't then fit for purpose. We would go out the prototype, which was a lot easier just to put together, and then if it was agreed that it was to go live, then obviously we would build it properly. We use a lot of content design and interaction design for a lot of the things that you would see on the either the ONS website, respondent home, or EQ. Underpinning that is what's called the ONS design system. That gives a lot of patterns that you'll see. So things like the logos, and a lot of the, you know, if you're going to use a radio buttons, all of that is in the ONS design system, so that it's very consistent with each other from an appearance point of view. And in actual fact, the ONS design system has now gone on and is being used in other areas in ONS, because you get a lot of functionality out of it, out of the box, in terms of both accessibility and also browser testing. Go on to the tech now. From a choice of hosting, originally for the 2017 test, we were using AWS. However, for the actual census rehearsal and 2021, we used GCP. Now, the reason for that is because we wanted to take advantage of Kubernetes, which at the time wasn't very stable from an AWS point of view, but it was on GCP. And the reason we needed to do that was because of the scaling that it gave out of the box. So it was really important, obviously, because of the numbers that we're dealing with. And also Google were fully engaged in supporting throughout the rehearsal and 2021, and were very responsive with any issues at all that we had. We worked in a DevSecOps way with security embedded in the team. So then when we had penetration testing carried out, there were very few issues found because they had been fully involved all the time. From a DevSecOps point of view, Census is a bit different than a lot of the things that people had worked on in a DevSecOps way in ONS before, because with Census there are key dates that you wouldn't want to be making changes to a production system, whereas with DevSecOps what you do actually is as soon as it's ready and tested, it goes into live. So an example would be we wouldn't want to make a change to something just before a reminder letter was going to be sent out. So we would store up the change, which isn't good practice from an IT perspective, to after that. So that was quite interesting, trying to persuade the developers into that way of working. We put a lot of effort into performance testing, as I've said previously, but also automation testing, so that if we did need to make any changes quickly when we were actually live, then we would be able to. We started in rehearsal with a fully remote working environment. We had a war room in Titchfield and a war room in Newport with the link open all the time, and it was really, really effective. People knew that they could come straight into the room and say, we've got a problem with this, or I need you to make a decision, etc. And it was very effective. And I think people were worried what it would be like supporting in like a an online environment. But in actual fact, it probably meant that you had more people willing to be available for more of the time. So I think there's pros and cons to it, and also as Helena has said, that we had to make changes from a tech point of view to EQ for some of the COVID questions. I'll go on to Census operational support now. So because obviously of the scale of the ask with this, it was a long-running support time. So we started in September 2020 supporting and finished in July 21. Now the reason for that, the starting to have support for that, is because FSDR went live in about September 20 because we onboarded community engagement officers at that point, and also around that time we sent out the print file to our supplier, who would be printing the letters and associated documentation. So it was quite a long process. So we also provided full support from February 21, which meant we had from 7 o'clock in the morning to 11 o'clock at night, we had a cover to support any issues. And overnight we had reduced cover, but to support any security issues that there might be, because obviously the data that was coming through the platform. To enable us to do this, we brought in third party to provide first line support during the day, with ONS resource available for anything that needed further investigation. So it was a big ask from the team, some of which were relatively small as well. But I think everybody was so bought into Census that we didn't have any problems in getting people to even do up to 11 o'clock on a Sunday evening and things like that. It was very good. Okay, so I will go on now to the slide, which is all about, I don't know, can you see my mouse? Underpinning the whole of the digital response was something called Census Response Management. It was a back-end system, so from a digital point of view, you didn't see anything, apart from there was a couple of admin type screens, but it really was the centre of the census. As you can see from the diagram, there are many arrows in and out of Census Response Management, and what I'm going to do is talk through the user journey for a respondent, really. So Census Response Management would have all the addresses in England, Wales and Northern Ireland loaded up into it with many attributes. So one of those attributes might be paper first, for example. Census Response Management would then know when it sent a print file to the supplier, it would know what it should be in. So should it have Welsh and English as an example, and things like that. So we would send the print file out to our print and post service. Within that, you would get a letter which would give you your unique access code, which also came from Census Response Management. And what would happen would be, on your letter, you would have a URL for you to go onto the Census website, which would then mean for someone to put in their code. So if you go up here, this is our Census website. It was it had lots of self-help in it, and it also had a engagement campaign, but then also it subsequently went on to be a call to action campaign, basically asking people to can you complete? So they would land on the website. On there, you might want to be doing something like looking at help as an example. What would happen then was you would be taken onto our Census Respondent Home section. In there, you would put the unique access code, and if all that was accepted, you would go onto the Census electronic questionnaire. At this point, there would be something which was sent to Census Response Management to say you had started your questionnaire, so that you could come back later if you wanted to. On Census Respondent Home, there was also a place where you could, for example, request a paper form. That would then, if you wanted to request a paper form, that would then come down into our address index matching service, which I mentioned earlier, which is an in-house matching service which we use internally, but we also use for the census. And so that would look up your address, it would bring it back, you would say, yes, that is my address, and then off you go. What would happen then? That would again update Census Response Management, and then that request would be sent out to our questionnaire management supplier, which would mean, again, saying whether it was Welsh, Northern Ireland or English a paper questionnaire that was needed. And then they would get a paper questionnaire in the post. If that had happened, then what the next step would be, that paper questionnaire would be sent out in the post, and we would also Royal Mail would know about that as well. So as soon as someone completed a paper questionnaire and put it back in the post, it would be scanned at Royal Mail, which is our paper questionnaire receipt service. It would be scanned at Royal Mail. It would also be scanned a barcode on the questionnaire at our questionnaire management supplier. And both of those actions would send in something to response management to say, we've received a paper form. Now, the reason that was so important was so that our field offices didn't go and knock on people's doors unnecessarily, because obviously that wouldn't be great. We did have a slight issue with that in a certain area, and there was quite a bit of publicity on social media about we were knocking on doors when people had already completed their forms. And it took us a couple of days to work out what the reason for that, but we did in the end, and we took measures to change that. So that, again, we're back to census response management. Another thing that might happen would be that someone might want to phone up the contact centre to either request a paper form, or it might be to complain. It could actually be anything. They might need help completing the electronic questionnaire. So we go to you ring up Census contact centre. There were different lines for whether you're Northern Ireland, Welsh or English. And the first thing again would be a call up to this address matching service to see if there was an address for you in the sample. If there was, great, then you could request a paper form, which again, as soon as you've done that, back to response management, out to the questionnaire management service, and that would be the same thing. Other things that they could ask for would be translations, as an example, which again were on the Census Respondent Home as well. However, you could also request a paper version of that via the contact centre. So then with the contact centre as well, we had a web chat feature where just normally like people are used to seeing on websites, where you could ask questions. That similarly with that web chat, you would then come into our contact centre API and then into response management to say to note that it had been a web chat conversation. So we knew everything that was, the respondent had engaged with us. So then the whole point of this obviously is to get someone to fill in their census electronic questionnaire, which Helena has obviously gone through. So with the census electronic questionnaire, you could come back and return to it later if you didn't want to complete it at that time. You could also request individual forms or an individual unique access code, which again would come into Respondent Home. You'd ask for a unique access code sent to you by text. That would be text to you as a result of it going to Census Response Management, and the text service being, we use GovNotify for that, to text out a unique access code to individuals, or you could ask for it by papers similarly. So let's go with the scenario where you have completed your electronic questionnaire. So what would happen then? Lots of things happened at that point where you press the submit button. It would update response management. It would send that data down into our data access platform, which is within ONS, to actually get the actual data into ONS. Also with it, what would happen as it updated response management, it would be sent down to what we call a fieldwork management gateway, which in turn would go to a fieldwork management tool called Toto Mobile. This was a very, very quick process, and it always astonishes me how quickly you could fill in a questionnaire, and what would happen would be we needed to get that person's address off the field officer's device very quickly, so that again we avoided knocking on doors unnecessarily. But it was really quick. It was amazing. The only other thing I'm going to say is from a electronic questionnaire point of view, I don't know if anyone saw any of the census, I'm going to say being advertised, but not in strict advertising terms, but as an example, on Gogglebox, there was a slot for census, and also on EastEnders, there was it wasn't very much, it was only like 20 seconds, 30 seconds. However, I was watching the figures go up, because as soon as I said previously, as soon as a question has been submitted, it updates response management. And I could see the MI, as soon as Gogglebot finished or EastEnders finished, as soon as that happened, you could see the responses go through the roof. It was absolutely amazing. I was very proud to work on this census. And like I say, that was just an amazing feeling just to see that. And I think that's it from me. Thank you. Apologies for the smallness of the screen.
That's great, Sarah. Thank you. I think we got there in the end. I could certainly see it. Hopefully you all could. And as I said, the slides will be coming around after the presentation. Gosh, the last slide there really just does show the complexity of the operation and all of the products, and how they all had to work together and operate as one. Great to see things we'd expect, like prototyping, accessibility test and design systems. And I think, given the time we had, you could really only touch on a few things, but you could do a whole other session on user research and on content design. And we've got a couple of communities of practice at CDPS, a new one around user research, which we're just setting up. And I'm sure they'll be interested in reaching out to you and speaking to you about that in a little bit more detail. If you could stop sharing your screen, I'm seeing two of me, which is a bit disconcerting, and we'll open the floor up for questions. We've got about 15 minutes because we do want to do the short feedback loop. But thank you, Sarah. That was really insightful, and Helena and Rob. Please pop your questions into the questions and answer tab, and we will come to them. I'll give a couple of minutes for a few to come in. I'll kick off, and I've got one around when new questions are added. So you mentioned, Helen, at the very start about new questions being added for every census. How do you determine the user need for those questions? And how do you determine which new questions to put in, and what's the process that you need to go through for including them?
Yes. Oh, I'm going to cough. No. So prior to the 2021 census, there was what was called the topic consultation. That was conducted in 2015. So it is conducted a long time in advance of the census, because there is a large development program that goes into it, as you've just seen. That consultation is a public consultation, and so anyone can provide a response to it. And we encouraged charities, local government, central government, businesses, etc., everyone who's got a data need for information from a census to provide it. That asked questions about the use of the data, so what the data would be used for, and that is the primary criteria of how it's decided. So it's not who's asking for it, it is what is it being used for, and what is the benefit of that. So it talked about the purpose and the type of information needed. So is it something that needs to come from a census? So do you need really small local area data, for example, which couldn't be given by a survey? Or do you need really granular data again that couldn't be given by a survey, or something else that the census provides and is part of that uniqueness of the census? So when we got the evidence in, we assessed those different answers to decide how strong the case was was for each of those. And where there was a strong enough case, it was either decided to keep in if it was a question that has already been in the census and we knew we had a good question for, or we set off a programme of work to decide whether or not it was appropriate to ask in a census context. So out of the consultation, we had new questions proposed on gender identity, sexual orientation, armed forces, veterans, and also, one I've forgotten. I think that was it. And so we assessed whether or not those could be asked, and those three were eventually put into the census because the research showed that it was appropriate.
Thank you. It's mad, isn't it, that the cut-off point is like 2015, so far out. What happens if a need is identified closer to the time, or is the cut-off point the cut-off point?
I think so. We did look at some additional requests through that time, but none of them had a sufficient level of need for us to take forward further. It is quite a strong cut-off point for a new need because obviously we need to have that development time to develop a question, but that also depends on whether or not there is an existing question and how long you think that there would need to be to develop a question. So for example, the gender identity question, we used that entire period to develop a question because there was no equivalent question already in use, whereas less work was needed to develop a question for the armed forces, for example, because it wasn't as complex a problem to solve. But it is quite a hard cut-off in that particular case.
Great, thank you, Helena. I had a good look around, and there's some really interesting census stories on your website as well, which really demonstrate how organisations use some of the data. So I'd encourage people to go and have a look at organisations like Aurora National Park and or the Go Back Cymru, Data Cymru, etc. So just some examples of how organisations are using the data from the census. We've got a question in from Jonathan Radcliffe, and Jonathan wants to know, did you consider the use of audio as part of the online form, potentially linked with accessibility? Who would like to take that?
I can take it, even though the answer is probably more on Sarah's side. So it was very much considered, and the electronic platform designers made sure that the electronic questionnaire was fully accessible for screen readers such as JAWS, etc. And that massive program of work around usability testing took that into account and made sure it was as accessible as possible. For those who don't use that type of technology, we also had a series of videos available on our help pages, which I can pop a link to in a second, which also were videos that people could access that talked them through the questionnaire.
Lovely, Jonathan. I hope that answers your question. If not, if you have any follow-ups, please pop it in the questions and answers box. Are there any other questions from attendees? No. Having my glass of water filled up here. It's in the background. One other question that I have then, and I'm not sure who wants to take this, but you talked about the slight differences in the digital form versus the print form and the instructions that you were able to provide, you know, such as furlough and quarantine and things like that. Did that impact the quality of the data later on down the line once you got the submissions in? So did you find that people were able to answer the questions better based on understanding, and were people who filled in the forms on print, I suppose, disadvantaged by not having those instructions? So just interested in your thoughts on that.
Oh, this is a question better for the QA team, but yes, is the simple answer in terms of the online. It did help our respondents. So before putting those additional instructions in, we did test those. We did some really last minute test rounds using the user research teams and also my own questionnaire development teams to check that those instructions would help people, and we did find that it was definitely helpful. So we know that for a fact. But I couldn't give you a firm answer around the online versus paper quality. That would be the quality team.
Thank you, Helena. And I'm going to ask one final question if I don't see any more in the chat. I suppose this is for Rob, for Sarah and for yourself. Biggest learning for you throughout the period and what you will take into your next piece of work. Who wants to go first?
So I'll go with that for the ONS design system. So it was the Census design system, but now that is being used in other areas of our surveys. For example, from business surveys perspective, I'm currently working on IDS, the website that we have built for IDS. It's very small at the minute, but we'll be expanding. That has been built on the ONS design system and also the Census website. So we have already started, reusing some of the technology. Similarly, with the response management system and EQ, we are using that for our business surveys and also social surveys as well.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Any from you, Rob or Helena? And we've got a final question from Klinos in the chat as well, which will be an interesting one.
For me, the main take forward was that small things can make big differences, and that respondent focused design is really, really important. So that's something that I'm very much aware of in my current role and taking forward to social surveys, is that real focus on making sure that respondents are understanding things and breaking it down into as small pieces as possible. So whilst you could potentially ask a question in one question, it actually in a lot of cases is better, even if it looks like more work because it's multiple questions, to ask it as multiple questions, because each of those questions is much easier. So 4 questions can be quicker to answer than 1.
Good advice. Yep, great. And Rob, what about you?
Yeah, in terms of biggest learnings for me, Edwina, I'll probably talk about this a little bit more in the session that we've got scheduled next, when I'm giving a fuller presentation. But I think on quite a high level, from my perspective, I think for the way that we did things for the 2021 census and the vast kind of benefits that there were from offering it more as a kind of digital service, and that being very much more kind of front and center, I think for the benefits that it offers, I think the increasing complexity that it also produces, I think is something that I've kind of learned not to underestimate. That in trying to kind of make the front end and the user experience as pristine as possible, and to factor in accessibility, there's a lot of work that you have to do then behind the scenes to make sure that that remains coherent and kind of fits together. And yeah, I think as far as the processing pipeline that we had for the actual data itself to get to the outputs, I think in terms of the diagram that is sometimes presented on that pipeline, I think it extends, when you put it out on the wall, to about 4.5 meters worth of pipeline, and that's not that's still kind of quite detailed within that as well. So yeah, it's not underestimating that kind of complexity, and kind of factoring that in as well would be
Lovely.
sort of the biggest learning from my perspective.
Thank you, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that next week. A question from Klinos to finish us off. While Helena is getting ready to answer this, if you could please go to menti.com as well and enter the code 761706. So the question from Klinos is the ability to toggle between Welsh and English, and to be able to choose your language based on pages. Did that increase the number of Welsh responses? Do you have an answer to that?
So the answer is kind of yes, but it's really quite difficult because you can't compare the metrics between the two. So like I said, in 2011, you had to make a choice at the start. So there was a very relatively small number, whereas for 2021, it was you could move in and out, etc. I believe, though, this was published after I left, and Rob's probably better to answer, that there is some metrics published on that. I couldn't tell you the answer off the top of my head, but I'm pretty certain it is available.
I would have to double check on that, Helena. What I was going to say is that I know that if they're not published already, there is the intention to publish metrics on Welsh responses. I think where that toggle kind of comes in, as you said, it actually how to kind of capture that and provide that in metrics that are reflective of the actual user experience is on the tricky side. But I know it's something that we've looked at, and I think based upon what it's possible for us to provide, as I said, we tried to be kind of transparent as we can around sort of the quality metrics that we have, and that's definitely something that, if it's not been published already, is scheduled to be published as we kind of wrap up sort of the outputs and the kind of publications from 2021 census.
Lovely. Cleanus will follow up on that with you post-event. Okay, thank you so much for your questions and for our three presenters from ONS to take time to answer them. Let's go to menti.com. We've got a couple of questions, and as I said, this is really just live feedback to help us prepare for the next two sessions that we have as part of this series. So menti.com 767006, and the questions that we want you to ask, basically you're agreeing or strongly agreeing or strongly disagreeing on a sliding scale. The webinar made sense to me. So if you could just answer that. I learned something new today. You could answer that. And the third, strongly agree, strongly disagree. I'd like to learn more about how ONS approached the census 2021. Question 1 of 3. And we will keep this open for a little while afterwards as well. Question 2 then, how did you find the session? So this is an open question. Are there any tools, resources that you would find useful following this? If you have any feedback that you would like to provide there, that would be great. And we have one more question, but I'll give you a second. And the third question, what else would you like to know about Census 2021? And we will make sure that we cover it in one of the next few sessions. Lovely. So hopefully you've all had an opportunity to provide feedback and help us shape the next two sessions. That has absolutely flown by. I can't believe we're coming up to 11 o'clock and finishing bang on time. So thank you so much to the presenters, to Helena and to Sarah and to Rob for providing the scene setting for us there. Information about the next two sessions. I know a number of you have already booked on next Thursday the 27th, and then we'll be taking a break for a week for the bank holidays and then coming back on Thursday the 11th with both sessions 9:30 to 11:30. So yeah, just Giacomo, thank you so much. I hope you found it useful, and I look forward to speaking to many of you on the 27th. Thank you very much.